This isn't some campfire ghost story. I didn't read this online or hear it from a friend of a friend. This happened to me. And I swear on everything, once you see this thing, you don't ever get away from it. So last summer, me and my buddy Danny decided to go on a camping trip. Just the two of us, getting away from it all. He'd just gone through a brutal breakup, I was burnt out from work, and we figured a few days out in the middle of nowhere would be just what we needed. We picked this isolated spot way out past the logging trails, deep in a forest that was dense, dark, and a hell of a drive from the nearest town. It was perfect. The first day was great. We set up the tent, cracked open some beers, just shooting the shit, letting all the city stress melt away. The place was dead silent except for the sounds of nature around us, like the whole forest had wrapped around us. Danny and I both felt a little on edge, but in a good way. City guys trying to be outdoorsmen for the weekend, laughing at our own paranoia. The whole area felt empty, and I think that's what made it feel safe. That night though, that's when everything went sideways. We had a little fire going, and Danny was just starting to pass out in his chair, when we heard this weird noise. It was like a low grunt, followed by what sounded like something scraping through the trees. I figured it was a raccoon or maybe a deer, something moving through the brush. I was about to joke that Danny was snoring loud enough to attract the wildlife when I saw his face, pale, wide-eyed, dead serious. "You hear that?" he whispered. I nodded. The sound was steady, getting closer. But it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was this deep, wet, scratching sound, almost like claws or nails dragging against bark. We put out the fire and crouched low, trying to see into the darkness around the camp. We were both trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. But whatever it was close. After a minute, the scratching stopped. Silence. Just the wind and our own breathing, loud and shaky. I was ready to chalk it up to an overactive imagination, but that's when we heard it, a slow, deliberate breathing. Thick, wheezy, like someone with lungs full of water. I'll never forget that sound. Danny looked at me, panic in his eyes. I could tell he was just as freaked as I was, but we didn't say a word. We didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. And that's when we saw it. At the edge of the clearing, right at the tree line, something was crouched low. It looked almost human, but wrong, like a badly made puppet. It was too thin, its limbs twisted and stretched out in ways that didn't make sense. Its skin was pale, almost gray, with this sickly sheen like it had been drenched in sweat. And its face? It didn't have a face, not really. Just these dark hollow pits where its eyes should have been, and a mouth that was too wide, stretched across its face in this hideous grin full of sharp, ragged teeth. I remember I whispered, "What the hell is that?" And that's when it turned its head, slowly, like it heard me. Those empty pits where its eyes should have been stared right into me, and I swear I felt it looking straight through me, like it could see every bone, every nerve. And then it smiled. Not a friendly smile, not even a crazy one. This thing smiled like it was amused, like we were the funniest little toys it had found in ages. Then it started to move, crawling forward on all fours, its limbs twisted like a spider, each movement slow and deliberate, as if it wanted us to know it had all the time in the world. I can't tell you how terrified I was. My body felt frozen, every instinct screaming to run, but I couldn't move. I don't think Danny could either. We just stood there, watching it crawl toward us, closing the distance inch by inch. It stopped right at the edge of the light from our lantern, just staring, its head cocked to one side like it was waiting. And then, out of nowhere, it stood up. Its body unfolded in this horrible, jerking motion, its limbs popping into place, until it was standing on two legs, towering over us. The thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, its arms hanging down to its knees. It just stood there, looking down at us, that twisted grin never leaving its face. I could smell it, this awful sickening stench, like rotting meat mixed with damp earth. My mind was racing, thinking of every horror story I'd ever heard, every monster movie, trying to make sense of it. But this thing didn't fit into any of that. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, and somehow that made it worse. It took a step toward us, and that's when Danny snapped. He grabbed a rock, chucked it at the thing with all his strength, yelling at it to get the hell away from us. The rock hit it square in the chest, and it just stood there. Didn't flinch, didn't even blink, if it even could. It just tilted its head the other way, like it was curious. That's when it opened its mouth. I thought it was going to scream or roar or something, but it didn't make a sound. Instead, it just breathed, this wet, rattling breath that filled the air with that awful stench. And then, without warning, it lunged. I don't remember much after that. I remember Danny shoving me, screaming for me to run. I bolted into the trees, not thinking. just running. I heard Danny behind me, heard his footsteps, and then, nothing. Just silence. I stopped, out of breath, and looked back, but he was gone. The forest was pitch black, silent as a grave. I ran all night, not stopping until I saw the first rays of dawn filtering through the trees. I stumbled my way back to the road, found a ride back to town, and I've never set foot in those woods again. I never saw Danny after that night. The police said they found scraps of his shirt, a few traces of blood, but no body. They called it a bear attack, said he must have gotten lost. But I know better. Sometimes, at night, I still hear that sound. The scratching, the breathing. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I swear I can see that twisted, grinning face staring at me from the shadows. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to know. All I know is, it's out there, somewhere. And if you ever hear something scratching outside your tent in the middle of the night, don't look, don't say a word. Just run.